Three figures waited on that lonely Vermont porch: a German Shepherd mom and her two tiny puppies, pressed together for warmth as snow drifted across their fur. For a year, they faced that same quiet road, watching the seasons freeze and thaw, guarding a hope no one else believed in. Miles away, a Navy SEAL named Caleb Turner fought through the last stretch of his journey home. A man scarred by ice, silence, and memories too heavy to speak aloud. No one thought he'd return. No one expected the dogs would still be waiting. But the moment their eyes met again, something shattered. Distance, doubt, and the cold year that tried to break them. What happened next will prove that loyalty remembers, even when the world forgets. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The morning had woken slowly over Maple Hollow, as if unsure whether it wished to rise at all. Winter clung to the quiet Vermont town in a thin veil of pale fog, draped across rooftops like silk that had forgotten warmth. Frost silvered every porch railing and window edge, and the lingering night cold left a crisp hush over the pine-lined road leading out of town. It was the kind of winter morning when breath came out white and soft, and every sound, every crunch of snow, every distant engine felt twice as loud in the chilled air. Caleb Turner stood beside his old dark blue pickup, the engine idling quietly behind him. He was a broad-shouldered Navy SEAL veteran of 40, lean and sharp-edged in the way men become when life has pushed them through more storms than they ever tell anyone about. His short brown hair was brushed with strands of early gray, a shade earned from cold nights in faraway places rather than age. A faint stubble followed the strong line of his jaw, the kind that hinted at a ruggedness he never tried to hide. His eyes, storm gray, steady, always observing, held a tiredness that came from carrying other people's burdens, other people's emergencies, and never quite knowing how to set them down. Today, though, those eyes softened as he looked at the German Shepherd sitting on the frost-covered porch steps. Mara was 6 years old, her black and tan coat thick and well-groomed even in winter. Strong posture, intelligent amber eyes, ears always alert. She had been Caleb's partner long before she ever became his companion. She trained with him, healed with him, and was the one steady presence in his life when deployments blurred into each other and memories took on shapes he didn't always want them to. Mara was gentle, but she carried a quiet strength in her stance, the strength of a loyal animal who had seen her human struggle and stayed anyway. Caleb knelt in front of her. "Girl," he murmured, running his calloused hand down her neck. "You're gonna stay with Mrs. Hayes while I'm gone. Just for a while. I'll be back before you know it." Mara nudged his palm, nose cold against his skin, sensing something deeper than the simple goodbye his words implied. Dogs like Mara always understood departures. They always felt the things humans tried to soften. Footsteps crunched lightly behind them. "Cold morning for a drive, Caleb," said Margaret Hayes, her voice warm even in the freezing air. Margaret Hayes was a 72-year-old widow with soft brown eyes and hair the gentle gray of winter clouds. She was petite, slight in frame, bundled in a thick knitted beige coat and a deep green scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her skin had the delicate lines of someone who had smiled more than she had frowned, someone who had lived long enough to value small joys. But there was a weight under those smiles, the kind that came from losing her husband to illness 7 years earlier. She lived alone in a white cottage next door to Caleb's, And though she never complained about loneliness, the silence of her house often pressed against her like a second winter. She stepped closer and touched Mara's head. "Don't you worry, sweet girl. I'll take good care of her, Caleb." Caleb rose, pulling on his gloves, trying to mask the tightness in his chest. "I know you will. She adores you." Margaret smiled. "Only because I give her too many biscuits. That's one way to earn loyalty." Caleb smirked, but the warmth faded quickly from his expression. He hadn't told many people about the mission in Alaska. It wasn't military deployment, not this time. More like a humanitarian assignment, helping train search and rescue teams in the remote ice fields. But 12 months in a place where daylight vanished for weeks and temperatures could kill a careless man. It wasn't something he wanted Mara to endure. And deep down, a small part of him feared leaving her, because Mara had been the anchor that steadied him after losing 2 teammates in an avalanche rescue years ago. The event had carved a hardness in him, a lingering ache he didn't voice to anyone, not even Mara. Margaret noticed the way Caleb's jaw tightened. "It's only a year," she said gently. "You've come back from longer things." Caleb nodded, though his heart stubbornly insisted this departure felt different. The porch steps creaked. A figure emerged from the house next door. Jimmy Harper, a 14-year-old boy with unruly dark blonde hair peeking out from beneath a knit hat. Jimmy was tall for his age, with a thin frame and slightly hunched shoulders, like someone trying not to take up much space. His freckled face always looked uncertain, as if every step in life required an internal debate. He had trouble talking to people his age, and often chose the company of animals instead, something Margaret had noticed early on. Jimmy shuffled closer. "Hi, Mr. Turner," he said softly, his voice still waking with the morning. "I came to, say bye. To Mara, too." Caleb smiled at the boy. "Thanks, Jimmy. She'll be glad to have you around. Helps her stay busy." Jimmy shyly reached out, letting Mara sniff his hand before patting her head. His touch was gentle, careful, like he believed every good thing in life might break if held too tightly. Caleb looked at the 3 of them, Mara, Margaret, Jimmy, and felt a strange comfort. It wasn't that he trusted easily. Life had taught him differently. But these were people who had never asked anything from him. They simply cared. He exhaled a cloud of cold breath. "Well, I should get going." Margaret stepped back as Caleb opened the truck door. Mara instantly stood, ears forward, body tense. She paced once, unsure whether she should jump in with him or stay behind. Caleb crouched again, this time letting her place her paws on his knees. "I know, girl," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'll miss you too, but you'll be safe here." Mara whined softly, a sound that tugged at the deepest part of Caleb's chest. He stood, forcing himself to move. He got into the truck, shut the door, and rolled down the window. "Thank you, Margaret," he said sincerely, "for everything." "You just come home safe?" she replied. He nodded once more, started the engine, and drove down the quiet frosted road. Mara stood on the porch, tail lowered, ears fixed on the fading hum of the truck. Her amber eyes followed the shrinking silhouette until it disappeared behind a curve of snow-covered pines. Only when the sound was truly gone did she sit down, right in the center of the porch, still watching the empty road. Margaret swallowed the knot in her throat. "Come inside, dear. It's cold." But Mara did not move. At 5:20 that evening, she returned to the exact same spot. Jimmy sat beside her for a while, telling her stories about school, hoping to ease her worry. But Mara kept staring down the road, as if memorizing it, as if she believed that studying every corner of that winter horizon would bring Caleb back faster. And as the days passed, Mara continued the ritual. Always 5:20, always the porch. She ate well, cared for her pups, yet held a quiet sorrow in the tilt of her head and the stillness of her posture. A loyalty carved deep into instinct. One evening, weeks after Caleb had left, Margaret heard a strange noise while closing the kitchen curtains. A low, breathy whimper drifted from the pantry where she had made Mara a warm nest. She walked over quickly, opened the door, and froze. Mara was lying on her side, breathing heavily. The blankets were dampened. Her belly tightened in waves. Margaret gasped softly. "Oh, sweetheart, you're expecting." She knelt beside the dog, stroking her gently as realization washed over her. Caleb had left without knowing Mara was pregnant. And now, in the quiet of Margaret's warm pantry, under the winter moonlight sneaking through the window, the first contractions began. The storm arrived before midnight, sweeping across Maple Hollow like a great white curtain pulled over the world. Snow pushed against the old windows of Margaret Hayes's cottage, humming softly as if winter itself was offering a lullaby nobody had asked for. The house was warm, wood stove crackling, soft lamps glowing. But inside the pantry, where blankets were stacked thick on the floor, a different kind of heat pulsed. The urgency of new life arriving too soon, too quietly, and without the man who should have been here to witness it. Mara lay curled in the nest Margaret had made for her, breath shallow but steady, her strong body tensed with each contraction. Her black and tan fur glistened with beads of effort, and her intelligent amber eyes shifted between focus and exhaustion. She was a resilient 6-year-old German shepherd, used to discipline and hardship. But this was a battle fought without training, guided only by instinct and the soft voice of the elderly woman kneeling beside her. Margaret, wrapped in a heavy navy robe and thick wool socks, held Mara's paw with both hands. She wasn't a large woman, barely over 5 feet tall, slight in frame, with silver hair pinned loosely behind her ears. But her presence felt impossibly steady. She had been a nurse decades earlier, before her husband's illness had taken most of her strength and half of her joy. Tonight, though, that old calm returned to her, the kind that came from knowing how to comfort someone who couldn't speak, but whose eyes said everything. "You're doing beautifully, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, stroking Mara's flank. "Just a little more." Outside, wind brushed against the house like restless fingers. Snow hissed against the porch, the storm thickening by the hour. But inside this tiny pantry, there was no room for fear. Only breath, warmth, and the tremble of paws preparing to welcome life. A soft whimper rose from Mara, followed by a tightening ripple across her body. Margaret leaned forward, adjusting the blankets, and then, with a gentle exhale from the dog, the first puppy arrived, a small bundle of black fur, slick and trembling, barely larger than Margaret's palm. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, lifting the pup with practiced gentleness. "Hello, little one." The puppy let out a fragile squeak, legs flailing weakly. Mara immediately lifted her head and licked her newborn with urgency, cleaning, warming, welcoming. Margaret smiled as she handed the puppy to Mara's care. Minutes passed before the second contraction came. This time, the effort was harder, longer. Margaret murmured comfort, her voice steady as the storm outside rattled the gutters. Finally, another puppy slid into her hands. This one, tan-marked, plumper, with a softer, round her face. "You're a big boy, aren't you?" Margaret whispered, placing him beside his sibling. Mara gathered both puppies with her head, curling her body protectively around them. She licked them feverishly, her eyes half closed from pain and relief, but also from something deeper, something almost reverent. In her gaze glimmered a quiet, aching joy, and a longing that Margaret recognized immediately. "I know," the old woman murmured. "You want him here. Caleb should be with you." Mara's ears twitched at the name, as if she believed he might walk through the pantry door the moment she heard it. The storm raged on, but life settled into the house as if it had always belonged there. Margaret checked the puppies carefully, noting the girl's delicate features and alert little snout. She named her Hazel, a name she'd always liked, warm and gentle. The boy, fuller and sleepier, she called Bruno. Something about his peaceful face reminded her of her late husband, who used to nap by the fire with the same contented stillness. By dawn, the storm softened. Snow clung thick on the porch railings, but inside, the tiny pantry was filled with soft squeaks and the steady sound of Mara's breathing as Hazel and Bruno nursed for the first time. Several hours later, Jimmy Harper arrived for his usual after-school visit, though school itself had been closed because of the heavy snow. He trudged through the yard in his oversized boots, hat askew, gloves mismatched, looking like a tall, awkward snowman with a backpack. When Margaret cracked open the front door, Jimmy's eyes widened. Did she? Margaret nodded warmly. "Come see," quietly. Jimmy followed her through the kitchen, his steps uncharacteristically careful. He had always been a shy boy, retreating into himself when others spoke too loudly, but around Mara, he was different, softer, steadier. When he peered into the pantry and saw the puppies for the first time, his entire face lit up. "Whoa," he breathed, kneeling on the blanket beside them. "They're so tiny." "They were born last night," Margaret said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hazel and Bruno. That's what I'm calling them for now, unless Caleb wants other names." Jimmy reached out, but didn't touch, just hovered his hand over them, afraid to disturb their sleep. His freckled face softened, and something warm flickered in his blue eyes. "They look safe," he whispered. "They are," Margaret replied. "Thanks to Mara." Mara lifted her head at the sound of her name and gave a soft tail wag before returning her gaze to the puppies. Her posture was proud, but her eyes held a quiet sadness, the kind that came from a mother who wanted someone else to witness this moment. Jimmy noticed. "She misses him, doesn't she?" "Very much," Margaret said softly. The boy nodded, absorbing that truth. He leaned in closer to the puppies, his shyness melting for a moment in the glow of new life. Over the next few weeks, Hazel and Bruno grew fast, eyes opening, paws strengthening, little voices becoming braver. Jimmy became braver too. He helped Margaret clean blankets, change water, and weigh the puppies on an old kitchen scale. He even started talking more, slowly at first, then with genuine excitement, telling Mara about his day at home, or how he was trying to raise his grade in science, or how he wished he understood people as easily as he understood dogs. Margaret watched him with quiet affection. For years, she had worried about the boy's loneliness, but something about having these puppies, something about feeling needed, made him stand straighter, speak clearer, and smile more often. Every afternoon, around 5:20 though, Mara's mood shifted. Even after nursing, After cleaning Hazel's ears or nudging Bruno back into place, she always walked to the porch. She stood at attention, eyes fixed on the snow-lined road leading out of Maple Hollow. Hazel once toddled after her, stumbling in the cold, and Bruno eventually learned to do the same. But Mara's gaze never softened. She stood like a sentinel carved from loyalty, watching the horizon, waiting for the figure she knew by scent, by memory, by heart. And one early evening, when the puppies were just old enough to open their eyes, Margaret witnessed something that made her chest tighten. Hazel blinked up at her for the first time. Big, glassy brown eyes staring at the world with a mixture of wonder and fragility. Bruno opened his moments later, blinking sleepily. But while the puppies discovered light and color for the first time, Mara was already at the door, staring out into the endless white, her eyes fixed on the very path Caleb had taken months ago. She never missed a day. She never missed a moment. She still believed he would return. Winter did not simply stay in Maple Hollow. It settled into the town like a quiet resident, lingering in every window frame and dusting rooftops long after the holidays had passed. As the weeks turned slowly into months, the snowbanks grew taller, and the forests surrounding the little town stood still, their branches weighed down by frost. Days were pale and short. Nights stretched endlessly. Yet inside Margaret Hayes's cottage, warmth found new ways to bloom. Mara's puppies, Hazel and Bruno, had grown from fragile, blind newborns into sturdy little explorers. Hazel, with her sharper snout and keen gaze, carried a spark of curiosity that made her fearless. She was only a few weeks old, but already tried to climb everything. Blankets, the pantry shelf, even Margaret's boot once, much to the old woman's amusement. Bruno, on the other hand, was softer both in build and in spirit. He had a rounder face, sleepy brown eyes, and a slow, thoughtful way of moving. He preferred naps on the warm, braided rug, often sprawling so dramatically that Margaret joked he was practicing to be a bearskin rug one day. Mara tended to them with unwavering devotion. She cleaned them, taught them how to steady their wobbly legs, nudged them toward food, and curled around them each night. But no matter how devoted she was as a mother, one habit never changed. Every afternoon at exactly 5:20, she made her way to the front door. Even as Hazel tugged at her tail, or Bruno cried for another lick, Mara would gently push them aside, walk to the porch, and sit, always facing the same road, always waiting. Margaret watched from the kitchen window many evenings, drying her hands on the same faded towel. She saw the silhouette of the German Shepherd against the winter sky. Ears alert, chest lifted proudly, gaze unbroken. The old woman felt a tug in her heart each time. She knew waiting. She knew how it hollowed a person quietly from the inside, how it carved a little ache into the bones. And maybe that was why caring for Mara and the puppies came so naturally to her. She understood the kind of loyalty that refused to fade. Life in the cottage grew full despite the cold. Margaret spent her mornings knitting by the stove, occasionally glancing at Hazel chewing on a toy, or Bruno waddling after his sister. She would talk to them softly, telling stories of her late husband Thomas, a tall, calm man with silver hair and warm hands who had loved winter because it made the world honest, as he always said. Sometimes her voice trembled, but Hazel and Bruno always crawled closer at those moments, as if soothing her in return. Jimmy Harper visited almost every afternoon. At 14, he was still lanky and awkward, with long legs that didn't quite match the rest of him, and a habit of fidgeting with the sleeves of his coat. His blonde hair stuck out under his hat no matter how many times he tried to flatten it. But his eyes, clear summer sky blue, softened every time he stepped into the cottage. "Mara, I'm here," he would whisper, almost reverently. Mara would turn from the porch, tail lifting once before she returned to her post. It wasn't indifference. She simply refused to miss even a second of the horizon. Jimmy never took it personally. He'd kneel by Hazel and Bruno instead, letting them sniff his gloves or climb his lap. Over time, Jimmy began talking more. He spoke about school, how history was interesting, but math was a battlefield he could never win. He told Hazel about the boy who teased him for being quiet and how he didn't know how to fight back with words. He told Bruno about the science fair project he wanted to build, a bird feeder with a camera so he could finally prove that blue jays are thieves. For the first time in years, he wasn't talking to fill silence. He was talking because someone, even if it was a puppy, listened without judgment. Sometimes Margaret would pause at the pantry door, smiling at the sight. Jimmy's shoulders were less hunched now, his voice a bit stronger, his hands steadier. Caring for the puppies gave him a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he needed. Despite the growing comfort inside the cottage, outside the world remained ruthless. The snowstorms of late winter became harsher, and Maple Hollow experienced one of the coldest seasons in decades. Icy wind rattled window frames at night, and thick gray skies threatened more storms. One brutally cold morning, a new visitor arrived. His name was Arnold Beck, a middle-aged mail carrier with a round belly, a knitted gray hat that barely contained his thick dark hair, and a mustache that looked like it belonged to a much more serious man. Arnold had been delivering mail in Maple Hollow for 20 years and was known for his kind manners and his tendency to whistle Christmas tunes well into March. Today, though, he looked unusually frustrated. He stomped the snow off his boots at Margaret's doorstep. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his breath puffing into the cold air. "Got something odd today." Margaret opened the door for him. "Oh, come in, Arnold. You're freezing." Arnold stepped inside, rubbing his hands together. "Roads are a mess. Storm last night knocked down some of the postal boxes up near Ridge Lane, and more importantly..." He paused, patting his mailbag. "We've had a delay in long-distance mail, Alaska shipments especially." Margaret's heart tightened. "Oh dear, Caleb's mail." "Likely," Arnold said, his expression turning apologetic. "Should have arrived 10 days ago. The tracking says it hit Vermont, but got stuck at the routing center. Weather's been cruel this week." Mara, hearing voices, came inside briefly, nose brushing the air. Hazel and Bruno hurried to her feet, wobbling as their tails wagged in excitement. "Still waiting for him, huh?" Arnold murmured softly, watching Mara with a sympathetic gaze. "She hasn't missed a day," Margaret whispered. "Not one." Arnold straightened his hat. "I'll keep an eye on the mail for you. If anything comes from Alaska, I'll bring it straight here." "You're very kind, Arnold," Margaret said. He shrugged with a half smile. "Hard not to be around these little ones." After he left, Margaret returned to the kitchen. Her stomach knotted with a blend of worry and hope. She didn't know what Caleb had written, but she knew it had been meant for Mara as much as for her. Some message of reassurance, of return. And now it was lost somewhere in miles of snow and ice. Days trickled by. Hazel and Bruno's playful chaos filled the cottage with movement. Jimmy grew braver. Arnold continued delivering mail with determined steps. But every evening at 5:20, Mara walked to the porch and resumed her post. Unwavering, unbroken, her gaze anchored to the horizon. On one such evening, as gray clouds gathered with quiet menace, the wind picked up sharply. Snow began falling with a wild, swirling force. Margaret closed the curtains early, feeling the chill seep through the walls. Hours later, Arnold's prediction came true. A massive blizzard hit Maple Hollow, the kind that erased roads and visibility entirely. The storm howled through the night, knocking tree branches against rooftops. When morning came, the roads were buried, the town silenced under inches of white. And somewhere in that chaos, the letter Caleb had sent, his message home, remained lost in the frozen miles. The sky over Maple Hollow finally cleared after nearly a week of relentless storms. It was the sort of winter afternoon Vermont rarely offered. Soft light spread across the snowbanks, the world wrapped in a blue-white glow that made everything look gentler than it truly was. The pines shimmered with frost, the porch railings sparkled, and for the first time in days, the wind felt like a breath rather than a warning. Inside Margaret Hayes's cottage, the unexpected brightness lifted everyone's spirits a little, even if they didn't admit it aloud. Hazel and Bruno were now bold enough to trot around the house on their slightly oversized paws. At nearly 2.5 months old, their personalities had settled firmly. Hazel, with ears that seemed too large for her head, had a posture that always leaned forward, like the world was perpetually calling her name. Bruno stayed close to Shadows, moving slower, more deliberate, as if each step needed careful thought. Their coats glowed warm gold beneath the afternoon light, and their dark snouts twitched as they tried to identify new smells drifting in from the freshly opened windows. Margaret was at the kitchen counter, preparing a simple stew, her hands moving steadily despite the ache in her joints. She looked older in winter, from the way her cheeks paled against the cold to the way her short gray hair flattened under knit hats. But her resilience had not dimmed. She set the wooden spoon aside and leaned slightly toward the window, her blue-green eyes narrowing. "Mara's out early today," she murmured to herself. Jimmy Harper, who had been kneeling on the floor helping Hazel chew a stubborn rubber toy, lifted his head. At 14, he had begun to fill out his lanky frame, but his awkwardness still clung to him like an oversized coat. His hair, always unruly, now fell over his forehead in soft blonde curls. "Is it even 5 yet?" he asked. "No," Margaret replied, wiping her hands. "Barely past 4. Jimmy stood, brushing snowflakes from his jeans. He had dragged half the outdoors inside during his arrival. "That's strange," he said, walking to the window to join her. They both peered out at Mara. The German shepherd stood rigid on the porch, every muscle tense, ears pointed straight toward the distant road. Her black and tan coat shimmered under the weak sunlight, and her breath formed faint clouds. She had always sat with quiet dignity, never frantic, never pacing, but now something in her posture was different. She wasn't merely watching the road, she was searching it. "She senses something," Jimmy whispered. Margaret's heart tightened. "Or she thinks she does." Mara took a few steps forward, slow, purposeful steps, until she stood near the wooden gate at the end of the walkway. It was the farthest she had walked since Caleb left. Hazel and Bruno followed behind her, but soon stopped, confused by their mother's sudden intensity. Hazel whimpered. Bruno sat heavily, tilting his head. Jimmy placed a hand on the window frame, his expression caught somewhere between awe and fear. "Do you think he's back?" Margaret didn't answer. She was too busy studying Mara's body. The raised tail, the stillness of her shoulders, the slight tremble running through her stance. Something had reached her. The faintest scent carried on the afternoon breeze, perhaps, but something powerful enough to stir a memory she guarded fiercely. Margaret slipped on her old wool coat and opened the front door. The cold struck her cheeks instantly. Jimmy followed after grabbing the scarf Margaret knitted for him last winter, one with mismatched stripes she had claimed were accidental but charming. When they stepped onto the porch, Mara didn't turn toward them. Her gaze stayed locked on the road, her nose lifting slightly, as though trying to pull scent from the wind. Margaret approached her slowly. "Mara, sweetheart," she said softly, "what is it you smell?" The dog didn't budge. Jimmy came to stand beside Margaret. "She looks like she's remembering something." "Or someone," Margaret said. Hazel and Bruno ran clumsily to their mother, their small bodies slipping in the snow. But Mara didn't move. She didn't nuzzle them or circle them protectively the way she normally did. She was waiting. Again. Margaret swallowed, feeling something fragile stir inside her chest. Hope and dread tangled so tightly she couldn't separate them. She placed a gentle hand on Mara's back. The German shepherd flinched, just barely, as if the touch broke whatever invisible thread she had been following. Then it came. A low rumble in the distance. A car engine growing louder. Mara's ears shot up, angled sharply toward the sound. Her tail rose. One paw lifted off the ground. Hazel barked, a tiny high-pitched sound that startled even herself. Bruno hid partially behind Jimmy's leg, peeking out nervously. The car approached along the snowy road, tires crunching through the slush. Margaret's breath halted. Jimmy pulled his scarf up to his mouth. "Mara," Margaret whispered, "please don't let this break you again." A dark SUV turned the corner, snow kicking up under its wheels. Mara took one step toward the gate, then another. Her breathing quickened, forming a cloud around her snout. Jimmy whispered shakily, "It could be him. It could be." The SUV passed the cottage without slowing. Mara's body froze mid-step. The car drove on, disappearing between the trees. She remained still for several seconds, the wind whispering around her. Then her tail fell. Her ears lowered, not flat in fear, just gently, painfully, in a way that made Margaret feel her own eyes sting. Mara turned and walked back toward the porch. Her steps were heavy, slower than they had ever been. Hazel and Bruno padded after her. Hazel nudged her mother's leg, confused. Bruno whimpered softly. Jimmy exhaled shakily. "Poor girl." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "She'll be all right. Hope is heavy, but she carries it well." When Mara reached the porch, she didn't sit in her usual place. She simply lay down near the door, resting her head on her paws, eyes half closed, but still facing the road. Margaret knelt beside her, stroking the thick fur between her ears. "One day, Mara, one day, he'll come back." But Mara didn't lift her head. And for the first time in months, it looked like the waiting had tired even her. The day hope trembled, but did not break. The next morning broke with a pale, uncertain light, the kind that seemed unsure whether to grow brighter or fade away. A thin layer of frost covered the branches, making them glitter like spun sugar. The sky hung low, tinged with a faint lavender that promised another cold day. Inside Margaret Hayes's cottage, the quiet felt more fragile than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening for something they feared might never come. Hazel and Bruno, now sturdier on their legs, played half-heartedly near the stove. Usually Hazel pounced on every shadow, every dust mote dancing in the sunlight. Today, she moved more slowly, often glancing toward her mother as if sensing her mood. Bruno stayed close to Mara's side, resting his small head against her flank. Mara lay near the front door, her large frame curled, but tense. The disappointment from the previous day still clung to her like an invisible weight. She hadn't cried out or paced. Mara never made scenes. But her silence was deeper, her stillness heavier. Even her ears, once sharp as blades, drooped slightly. Margaret noticed immediately. The old woman moved around the kitchen with deliberate gentleness, as though afraid any loud noise might deepen the dog's sadness. Her short gray hair was tucked behind her ears, and her warm brown sweater was layered beneath her thick apron. She carried herself slowly, one hand on her hip to support her stiff joints. But her eyes, soft blue-green with years of loss and patience inside them, watched Mara constantly. Jimmy arrived a little after 10, bundled in his winter coat and a mismatched scarf wrapped several times around his neck. His blonde hair stuck out from beneath his hat in stubborn curls, and his boots were dusted with powdery snow. He stepped inside and stopped immediately when he saw Mara. She didn't sleep much, Margaret told him quietly as she poured tea. Kept lifting her head at every little sound. Jimmy swallowed hard. He had grown deeply attached to Mara over the months, more than he liked to admit even to himself. She had become a quiet anchor for him, someone whose company felt safe when the world at school did not. Seeing her so drained, so sorrowful, made something twist painfully inside his chest. He kneeled beside her. "Hey, girl," he whispered, brushing his fingers along the soft fur behind her ear. Mara didn't lift her head. Her eyes remained fixed on the door. Hazel toddled over and climbed onto Jimmy's lap, demanding attention she usually never needed to beg for. Bruno followed, instead bumping against Jimmy's elbow until the boy gently hugged both puppies. Even they seemed to sense that the cottage's warmth had dimmed. Margaret set a plate of biscuits on the table. "Jimmy, sweetheart, have a snack before it gets cold." "I'm not hungry," Jimmy murmured. She touched his shoulder gently. "You can be worried and still eat, you know." Jimmy nodded reluctantly, but stayed where he was. The house stayed quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that feels like holding your breath. Then it came. A car door slammed outside. Not softly, not far away. Sharp, sudden, close. Mara's head shot up instantly. Her ears snapped to attention. Her whole body surged with a jolt of recognition so powerful it nearly knocked Hazel and Bruno over. Hazel squeaked in confusion as Mara bolted forward, paws skidding on the wooden floor. Bruno tumbled backward, legs flailing, as his mother rushed past him with a force he'd never seen. Jimmy gasped. "It's him! It has to be!" Margaret didn't even have time to answer. Mara burst onto the porch, her claws scraping against the frozen boards. Her breath came fast and sharp, forming clouds that drifted behind her as she bounded toward the gate. Her tail was high, her posture electric with hope. She sniffed the air fiercely. Jimmy sprinted after her, nearly slipping on the rug as he pulled open the door. Margaret followed, clutching the railing for balance as she stepped outside. A white utility van stood at the edge of the road. A tall man in a blue-gray uniform stepped out, slamming the van door behind him. He was middle-aged, with a narrow face, pale stubbled chin, and deep-set tired eyes. His name patch read Caldwell. His heavy tool belt clicked with each step. His expression was that of a man who had worked too many winters in too many cold towns. Serious, impatient, and only mildly apologetic. He froze when he saw the German Shepherd barreling toward him. "Whoa, easy there," he said, raising his hands. Mara stopped inches from him, chest heaving, nose searching desperately for a scent she longed for, but the air held nothing of Caleb. Caldwell blinked. I'm here to check the meter? Power company sent me. Got a report of faulty readings in this area." Jimmy's heart fell so fast, he felt dizzy. Margaret closed her eyes as though steadying herself. Mara stared at Caldwell for several seconds, her tail dropping slowly like a wilting branch. She took one step back, then another. The realization hit her like a blow. This wasn't her person. The man adjusted his cap awkwardly. "Sorry, girl. Didn't mean to scare you." But Mara wasn't scared. She was breaking. Jimmy felt his throat tighten. "She thought you were someone else," he whispered to the man, voice unsteady. Caldwell nodded sympathetically. "I get that sometimes. Dogs get attached." He didn't understand the depth of it. Not really, but his tone was gentle enough. Mara turned away, no energy left in her body. She walked slowly back toward the house, each step heavy and unsteady. Hazel and Bruno rushed to her, bumping against her legs, whining softly. She didn't nudge them back. Jimmy couldn't take it anymore. His eyes filled, and he quickly wiped them with the sleeve of his jacket. Margaret saw it. She stepped beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Despite her small frame, her hug felt strong. "It hurts to see someone hope," she said softly, "especially when you know that hope is fragile." Jimmy sniffed, trying to hide how deeply it cut him. "I just want her to be happy." Margaret's eyes clouded with a memory older than Jimmy's entire life. "When my Thomas went to war, I waited too. Every morning I checked the mailbox. Every night I set his chair beside the fire as if he'd walk in at any moment." Her voice grew soft. "Hope keeps you alive, but it also makes you tremble." Jimmy leaned into her quietly. They stayed like that for a long moment, while Caldwell finished checking the meter and drove off. The road returned to silence. No more engines. No more false promises. Inside, Mara ignored her food bowl entirely, a first. She lay down by the door, the puppies climbing on top of her, trying to comfort her in ways they barely understood. Her gaze fixed on the empty road beyond the frosted window. Hope had trembled, and for today, it had won. Night in Maple Hollow had a way of stretching like a sheet of dark velvet, soft, quiet, and heavy. Snow blanketed everything under its patient silence, smoothing the edges of fences, softening rooftops, and muffling even the crunch of distant tires. Margaret Hayes's cottage sat nestled in that stillness, its windows glowing amber against the vast white world. Inside, warmth lingered from the wood stove, and the soft hum of the old television filled the room. Margaret was seated in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a thick knitted shawl, the color of autumn leaves. Her hair, short and silver, caught the lamplight in gentle strands. She had the look of someone who had weathered many winters, lined skin, soft jaw, eyes that gleamed with a mixture of patience and quiet resilience. Jimmy lay stretched on the rug nearby, flipping through channels half-heartedly. His unruly blonde hair fell into his eyes as he tried to keep Hazel from chewing the corner of a throw pillow. Bruno slept beside him, his round belly rising and falling with each tiny breath. The cottage had finally settled into a rhythm after the emotional blow from earlier. Mara, exhausted by her heartbreak, had fallen asleep near the door, her breathing slow and deep. Every now and then, her ears twitched, a faint, automatic reaction to sounds she couldn't bear to ignore completely, but she didn't get up, not once. Margaret turned the volume down when a commercial came on. "You all right over there, Jimmy?" she asked. Jimmy shrugged, eyes still on Hazel. "Just tired, I guess. Today was rough." His voice held a small quiver he tried to swallow. Hazel pawed gently at his hand, as if sensing the wobble in his emotions. "Some days stretch the heart a little thinner than others," Margaret said gently. Before Jimmy could reply, Bruno suddenly jerked awake with a sharp whine. His small head snapped toward the door. Hazel stiffened too, ears perked, tail beginning to tremble. "Easy now," Jimmy whispered, reaching to soothe them. But Mara's eyes shot open before he could touch the puppies. No hesitation, no slow rise. Mara sprang to her feet with a force that made the doorframe tremble. Her claws clicked loudly against the wooden floor as she lunged forward, pushing through the rug and nearly knocking over a boot by the mat. She didn't bark. Not yet. She didn't cry. She just froze in front of the door, body tense, head high, nose lifting sharply as she inhaled. Margaret straightened, heart pounding. "Mara?" Jimmy stood so quickly he stumbled over Bruno. "What's wrong? Did she hear something?" But it wasn't hearing. It was scent. Mara inhaled again, deeper, sharper, her chest expanding as though she were drawing the entire night into her lungs. The fur across her shoulders lifted slightly. Her tail rose, her ears pushed so far forward they looked like they belonged to a younger dog. Then she took one step toward the door, another, then a third. Hazel barked once, a small but piercing sound. Bruno whimpered and pressed himself against Jimmy's leg, trembling. "Mara?" Margaret whispered again. This time, Mara answered. She let out a sound none of them had heard before. Not a bark, not a whine, something deeper. An urgent, trembling sound, rising from somewhere buried under the weight of a year's worth of waiting. It was as if the past 12 months had compressed into one tiny point inside her chest, and now that point had cracked open. Jimmy felt chills erupt across his arms. This feels different. Margaret nodded slowly, her breath trembling as well. It is. Because this wasn't the frantic hope of yesterday. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't desperation. This was recognition. Mara pushed her nose against the door, sniffing fiercely, as if pulling scents through the wood. She backed up, pacing once, unusual for her, intensely focused, as if preparing herself for something enormous. Then she pressed her paw to the door. A deliberate gesture, soft, yet certain. Hazel and Bruno ran circles around her legs, barking in uneven bursts. They didn't understand the moment, but they felt its electricity humming through the room. Margaret stood up, pushing off the armchair for support. Her breath fogged slightly in the cold air near the door. "She's not guessing this time," she whispered. "She knows." Jimmy stepped beside her, eyes wide with hope he didn't dare name. Is Caleb really home?" Before Margaret could answer, a sound drifted in through the cold winter air. Crunch. Soft but clear, snow shifting under weight. Then again. Crunch. Slow. Heavy. Measured. Footsteps. Not the hurried steps of a stranger. Not the random pacing of someone lost or checking meters or delivering packages. These footsteps carried something different. A burden. A purpose. A return. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled instantly in her eyes. Not because she saw anything yet, but because her bones, Her memory, her heart, knew exactly what those sounds meant. She had once listened for footsteps like these decades ago, when Thomas had returned from war. The sound of someone carrying not just their own weight, but the weight of the world they are returning from. Jimmy's breath caught hard in his throat. "It's him," he said hoarsely. "It has to be." The footsteps grew closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow, but certain. Mara's posture transformed. Ears forward, tail lifted, chest rising with each shaking breath. She didn't move from her spot at the door. She stood perfectly still, as if her stillness could hold the world in place. Hazel stopped barking. Bruno's trembling ceased. The puppies pressed themselves against Mara's legs and fell into silence, as if understanding that something sacred stood at the threshold. Jimmy grabbed Margaret's hand. "Do we open the door?" Margaret shook her head, voice barely a whisper. "No, sweetheart. This moment belongs to her." Outside, the crunching footsteps reached the walkway. Snow shifted under a heavy boot, then another, then paused, right at the gate. A breath of wind pushed through the porch railing, carrying with it a faint, unmistakable scent. Salt, iron, foreign dust, jet fuel, and beneath it all, the scent of home. Mara's entire body trembled, not with fear, not with longing, with recognition. A year's worth of waiting sharpened into a single breath. She pressed her nose harder into the door seam and inhaled one final time. And something changed in her eyes. Something ancient and instinctive. She knew. She knew. Then came the sound that sealed everything the past 12 months had held tightly. The gate latch clicked open. Snow drifted gently across Maple Hollow, as if the night itself were holding its breath. The cottage porch glowed with a faint amber halo from the single bulb above the door, its light stretching only far enough to touch the first boards of the walkway before surrendering to darkness. The world felt paused, suspended between heartbeat and silence. Mara stood at the door like a statue carved from devotion. Her body trembled, not the frantic tremble of hope she'd felt many nights, but something deeper, ancient, instinctive. Hazel pressed tight against her left leg, her tiny body rigid with a fear she couldn't name. Bruno stayed on the right side, eyes wide, tail curled under him. The puppies didn't know what was coming. They only knew their mother had transformed into something fierce, unmoving, alert. Margaret Hayes stood a few steps behind them, clutching Jimmy's hand so tightly that her knuckles were pale. The lamp behind her made her short silver hair glow like a crown. Tears pooled in her warm blue-green eyes, though she couldn't yet see the man approaching. She didn't need to. Her bones recognized this kind of moment. A lifetime ago, she had waited in a doorway exactly like this. Jimmy felt frozen too. He was 14, still a boy, still shaped by his shy nature and the quiet edges of loneliness. But in this moment, he felt older. He stood at Margaret's side, his unruly blonde curls falling into his eyes as he leaned forward, breath fogging in front of him. Hazel's nervous barking faded to whimpers, and Bruno let out a small cry. Jimmy wanted to kneel down and comfort them, but he couldn't move, because the footsteps were close now, slow, deliberate, each one crunching into the snow with a weight that didn't belong to a stranger. The air shifted with something warm beneath the cold. Dust, sun, iron, distant places layered upon one another. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the walkway. He stepped into the faint ring of porch light, and everything inside the cottage seemed to exhale at once. Caleb Turner looked different from the man who had left a year ago. His once black hair now held threads of pale silver near the temples, short and windswept like he'd fought storms on the way home. His beard, once trimmed tight, now framed a jaw sharper than before. His face was leaner, the angles deeper, the skin weathered by sun, wind, and hard corners of the world that had demanded more than anyone should give. But his eyes hadn't changed. Their warm hazel color softened the sharp edges of his face, glowing with a gentleness that held every memory of the home he'd left behind. Eyes full of weariness, eyes full of longing, eyes full of love. Mara, his voice cracked instantly. Sweet girl. He stopped at the gate, chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, a duffel bag slung across his shoulder. Snowflakes clung to his uniform jacket, navy blue, worn at the seams, the patches slightly faded from the year's trials. His boots were caked with snow and grime from miles untold. He looked like a man who had been through fights no one at home would ever see. But none of that mattered now. Mara stiffened, her ears pushed forward so sharply they almost folded. Her breath hitched, body trembling, as if afraid to believe what stood before her. Her paws inched forward, claws pressing into the wooden threshold. Caleb slowly lowered his duffel bag to the snow. The heavy thud echoed through the quiet night. Then, in a voice that carried a year's worth of ache, he whispered, "Mara, I'm home." Mara took one small step, then another. Her tail twitched, lifted, then fell again, caught between hope and fear, memory and doubt. Her chest rose as she inhaled deeply, pulling in the scent she had waited 4 long seasons for. Her legs trembled visibly. Caleb dropped to his knees in the snow. He opened his arms, slow, careful, trembling. His breath shook. "It's me, girl. I'm right here." Mara broke. She lunged forward, her paws hitting his chest with a force that nearly knocked him backward. She pressed her forehead into his collarbone, letting out a long, raw howl that seemed to rip from somewhere deep inside her soul. Caleb wrapped his arms around her instantly, burying his face in her fur. "Oh, God! Mara!" His voice cracked again, hoarse and breathless. "I missed you. I missed you so much." Hazel and Bruno yelped in confusion at first. Then Hazel, braver and more curious, rushed forward, circling Caleb's legs. She sniffed frantically, tail whipping in frantic bursts. Bruno followed slowly, his round face full of wonder. When he reached Caleb's knee, he placed one tiny paw on his boot and whined softly. Caleb pulled back just enough to look at them, eyes wide with shock, then soft with overwhelming emotion. "Puppies," he whispered. You had puppies?" He placed his hand gently atop Hazel's head. She licked his glove instantly. Bruno sniffed his fingers carefully before curling his body against Caleb's boot. Caleb's smile trembled. "Guess I'm a dad twice over now, huh?" Margaret stood on the porch, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand covering her mouth. She wasn't a dramatic woman, never had been, but this moment pulled every buried emotion to the surface. She leaned against the porch column, shaking with relief and gratitude. Jimmy couldn't stop crying either. The boy tried to wipe his face with his sleeve, embarrassed, but the reunion before him was something bigger than pride. He stepped closer, drawn forward by something he couldn't resist. Caleb looked up at them both. His eyes softened even further. "Mrs. Hayes. Jimmy? Thank you." Margaret shook her head, still crying and smiling. "You came home, Caleb. That's what matters." Jimmy swallowed hard. Mara waited every day, every day. Caleb pressed his forehead to Mara's again, whispering, I know, sweetheart. I know. He reached out, pulling Hazel and Bruno closer with his arms until he held all 3 dogs against him. Snow fell quietly over them, soft white flakes catching in his hair and on the puppy's fur. Caleb closed his eyes tightly, drawing them into his chest as if trying to make up for every day he had been gone. I'm here now, he murmured. And no one has to wait like that again. I promise you. Mara lifted her head, licking the side of his face before pressing into him once more. Hazel wiggled excitedly at his knee. Bruno let out a deep, satisfied sigh, curling against his father for the first time. And in that moment, 3 dogs, 1 man, and a porch bathed in winter light, the year-long wound began to close. Caleb Turner had come home, and everything broken began to mend. Morning broke gently over Maple Hollow. The sky brushed with faint strokes of rose and pale gold, as if winter itself had decided to soften its hold for one quiet day. The storm clouds that had haunted the past weeks drifted farther into the mountains, leaving behind a stillness so rare that even the pines seemed to breathe easier. Thin rays of sunlight crept between the branches and glided across the snow-covered fields, touching the roofs, fences, and frozen streams with the first promise of spring. Inside Margaret Hayes' cottage, now half sanctuary, half joyful chaos, warmth pulsed from the wood stove, filling every room with the scent of pine logs and stew that had simmered overnight. It was the kind of morning that felt like a gentle exhale after a year of holding everything in too tightly. Caleb Turner stood near the doorway, still wearing the navy blue jacket he had traveled home in. Now, under morning light, the details of his face were clearer. The sharp jaw softened by a growing beard, faint lines near the eyes carved by long months of desert winds and sleepless nights, and a quiet strength tucked beneath the exhaustion. He was tall, over 6 feet, with shoulders built from years of carrying weight far heavier than his duffel bags. But for the first time in a year, the hardness in his expression had loosened. He looked like a man relearning how to breathe. Mara padded to his side, tail sweeping the wooden floor. Her eyes were bright, alert, full of certainty instead of the restless searching that had once defined her every evening. She carried something in her mouth, an old toy, worn and frayed, the fabric thin from years of companionship. It was shaped like a small stuffed rabbit, colors faded to indistinguishable shades, a toy Caleb had given her when she was barely a year old. She set it gently on the floor, right beside his boots. Caleb knelt, brushing his fingers across her fur. "You remembered this old thing?" he whispered, voice roughened with emotion. Mara pressed her forehead into his palm. Hazel and Bruno, still drowsy from the excitement of the previous night, toddled from their blanket near the stove. Their coats, puffs of warm gold and black, gleamed in the warm light. Hazel stretched, her lanky legs wobbling slightly, then trotted confidently toward Caleb's knee. Bruno followed, slower but determined, his round tail wagging so hard it made his whole backside wiggle. Both puppies collapsed onto Caleb's boots as if they had been waiting a lifetime to do so. "Guess you two made up your minds," he chuckled softly, his voice cracking in the middle. Hazel let out a small bark. Bruno sighed contentedly and fell asleep instantly. Behind them, Margaret watched from the kitchen with a soft smile. She leaned against the counter for support, her short silver hair reflecting sunlight, her sweater sleeves slightly rolled up. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened as she smiled. wrinkles carved by years of love, loss, and the kind of patience only time could teach. She had the look of a woman who finally saw a story ending well. Jimmy arrived a short while later, stomping snow off his boots. He was wearing the same mismatched scarf, and his cheeks were red from the cold. But there was something new in the way he moved. Straighter back, steadier steps, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there a few months ago. "Mr. Turner?" he asked shyly, hovering near the threshold. Caleb stood up, brushing snow from his jacket. "Jimmy?" he said warmly. "I hear you helped take care of them all year." Jimmy blushed fiercely. I did my best." Caleb placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you. Really." Hazel barked again, which Jimmy interpreted, correctly, as a summons to come sit by her. He laughed, the sound much freer than the hesitant chuckles he once gave. He knelt beside the puppies and let Hazel climb onto his lap, while Bruno curled against his knee. Margaret placed steaming mugs of hot cocoa on the table. "Breakfast is ready when you are. And Caleb, you look like you need food that isn't vacuum sealed." He laughed, an honest, deep laugh that made Margaret tear up again. The day unfolded gently. Caleb brought his duffel bag from the porch and unpacked slowly, the process turning into a ceremony of healing. Mara followed him room to room, never losing sight of him, sometimes nudging the bag with her nose as if checking that he wasn't packing again. Inside the bag were pieces of a life carried far away for too long. A folded U.S. Navy cap, worn gloves, a snapshot of him and Mara from years before, a compass nicked along the edges. Each item he set down seemed to stitch him back into the home he had left. Meanwhile, Margaret brewed soup and baked biscuits, humming an old tune. Jimmy played with the puppies, teaching Hazel how to sit and Bruno how to roll onto his side. The cottage filled with laughter, soft barks, the clatter of pots, sounds that transformed the home into something new, something whole. That evening, as the sun faded and the sky turned a deep velvet blue, the temperature dropped again. Frost began forming along the window edges. Margaret and Jimmy eventually left after dinner, Jimmy promising to return tomorrow to help Caleb build a small puppy bed. Margaret hugged Caleb tightly before leaving. "You filled the empty space this home has carried," she whispered. Caleb squeezed her hands. "Thank you for keeping them alive, for keeping them safe." After they left, the cottage grew quiet again, but not the uneasy quiet of waiting, nor the aching quiet of longing. A warm, peaceful quiet. Caleb stepped onto the porch, the same porch Mara had waited on every evening for months. The boards creaked softly under his boots. The snow glittered like stardust beneath the moonlight. Mara followed him, settling beside his leg. Hazel and Bruno, though tired, insisted on waddling after their mother, curling near Caleb's feet like tiny living slippers. Caleb sat down on the top step, resting his elbows on his knees. Mara placed her head on his thigh with a heavy, contented sigh. He stroked her fur slowly, thoughtfully. "You've been through so much," he murmured. "All of you." Mara lifted her head to look at him. Caleb smiled, a smile that didn't hide any pain, but welcomed healing. "From now on," he said softly, "this porch isn't a place for waiting anymore, but a place for us to watch new seasons arrive, together." Mara licked his hand once, slow, meaningful. Her answer. Hazel yawned. Bruno curled tighter. Snow drifted lightly across the front yard. And for the first time in a year, the porch belonged not to longing, but to a family complete again. In the end, this story is not only about a Navy SEAL returning home, or a loyal dog who never stopped believing. It is a quiet reminder that in the ordinary corners of our lives, miracles still unfold, sometimes in the shape of a mother dog waiting on a porch, sometimes in the warmth of a family rebuilt, sometimes in a heart learning to hope again. Many people say miracles are rare, but perhaps they are simply gentle things that we overlook until the moment God decides to open our eyes. If this story touched you, take a moment to look at your own life, the people who wait for you, the loyalty you sometimes forget to notice, the small blessings placed in your path. These quiet mercies are not coincidences. They are signs that even in the coldest seasons, God has not stopped writing goodness into our days. If you believe in moments like this, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that hope still finds its way home. Leave a comment about where you're watching from and what blessing you're grateful for today. And if you want more stories that warm the heart and honor the love God plants in this world, make sure to subscribe to the channel. May the Lord watch over you and your family, and may His grace continue to guide your steps, one quiet miracle at a time.